Sometimes the biggest mistake is not what you do, it is who you decide to blame. The red and blue lights appeared so suddenly that several people in the pharmacy parking lot stopped walking and turned toward the sound. Rain had been falling for nearly an hour, coating the pavement in a thin layer of shimmering water that reflected every light in sight. Naomi Carter stepped out of the automatic doors carrying a small paper bag and pulled her coat tighter against the cold evening air. She had just finished a 12-hour shift at St. Matthew Children's Hospital, and all she wanted was to get home. Her feet ached. Her shoulders felt heavy. The thought of a warm meal and a quiet evening with her husband was the only thing keeping her moving. Then a police cruiser rolled to a stop directly beside her. The driver's door opened immediately. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped out with the confidence of someone who believed he already knew the answer. His eyes locked onto Naomi before he even reached the sidewalk. The rain tapped softly against the hood of the cruiser while nearby shoppers slowed their pace to watch. Naomi stopped walking. Confusion crossed her face. "Ma'am," Ryan called. "I need you to stay right where you are." The tone in his voice caused several heads to turn. Naomi glanced behind her for a moment, almost expecting him to be speaking to someone else. But he was looking directly at her. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly. Ryan approached another few feet. His hand held a small tablet displaying information she could not see. He studied the screen, then her face, then the screen again. The expression in his eyes grew more certain with every second. "I need to see some identification." Naomi felt an uncomfortable knot form in her stomach. She slowly reached into her purse and handed him her driver's license. Ryan examined it carefully. The rain continued falling. Cars moved through the intersection beyond the parking lot. A distant thundercloud rolled across the dark sky. Yet the entire world suddenly felt smaller, quieter, focused on this one strange moment. Ryan typed something into the tablet, waited, read the response, then looked back at her. "Where have you been today?" Naomi blinked. "At work." "Where do you work?" "St. Matthew Children's Hospital." Ryan nodded, but his expression did not change. "And before that?" "At home." A small crowd had begun forming near the storefront windows. Some people pretended to check their phones while secretly watching the conversation. Others openly stared. Naomi could feel their eyes. The attention made her increasingly uncomfortable. "Officer, what is this about?" she asked. Ryan looked toward the screen once more. A witness provided a description connected to an active investigation. Naomi frowned. "And you think that description matches me?" Ryan did not answer directly. The silence itself was answer enough. Naomi exhaled slowly. Her pulse quickened, not because she believed she had done anything wrong, because she suddenly realized she was being viewed as someone she was not. Another patrol vehicle entered the parking lot. The sight immediately changed the atmosphere. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. Ryan appeared even more confident now. Whatever information he believed he had, he trusted it completely. But Naomi's attention drifted somewhere else. Earlier that afternoon, while leaving the hospital parking structure, she had noticed a man standing beside a silver sedan. At the time it seemed insignificant. Yet something about the memory had remained with her. The nervous glance over his shoulder, the hurried conversation, the uneasy feeling she could not explain. For hours she had tried to forget it. Now the image returned with surprising clarity. Ryan stepped forward again. "Ma'am, I need you to come with us so we can ask a few questions." Naomi stared at him. Rainwater slid down the side of the cruiser and pooled at the edge of the curb. The parking lot lights glowed against the wet pavement like scattered stars. Around her, strangers continued watching. Some whispered. Some recorded. Naomi took a slow breath and looked directly at the officer. "I think you're looking at the wrong person," she said quietly. Ryan's expression never changed. "That is what we're here to find out." But as Naomi glanced once more toward the dark city beyond the parking lot, a different thought settled heavily into her mind. If they were focused on her, then nobody was looking for the man beside the silver sedan. And somewhere out there, he might already be disappearing into the night. The ride to the precinct felt longer than it actually was. Rain tapped steadily against the cruiser windows while streaks of white and amber light slid across the glass from passing cars. Naomi Carter sat quietly in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the city blur by. Officer Ryan Mitchell remained focused on the road ahead, occasionally speaking into his radio in short, professional responses. Nobody said much. The silence left too much room for thought. Naomi kept replaying the image from earlier that afternoon. The silver sedan. The nervous man. The strange feeling she had ignored. At the time it seemed like nothing. Now it felt important. Very important. The cruiser finally turned beneath the covered entrance of the police station. Bright lights illuminated the wet concrete as officers moved through the building carrying folders, coffee cups, and laptops. Naomi stepped inside and immediately felt dozens of unfamiliar eyes glance toward her before returning to their work. She was guided down a hallway and into a small interview room. The space was simple. A metal table. 4 chairs. Pale walls. A single clock ticking softly above the door. The officer closed the door behind her. For the first time that evening, Naomi was completely alone. She exhaled slowly and sat down. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Somewhere beyond the walls, telephones rang. Footsteps crossed polished floors. Voices drifted in and out of hearing. Naomi stared at the tabletop while the events of the evening continued circling through her mind. She thought about the children at St. Matthew Children's Hospital. She thought about the families she had comforted that morning. Most of all, she thought about Daniel. Her husband would be wondering why she was late. She considered calling him. Her phone remained inside her purse on the opposite side of the table. Yet something stopped her. She still believed the misunderstanding would be resolved. The truth was simple. Facts existed. Eventually someone would verify them. The door finally opened. A detective entered carrying a notepad and a tablet computer. Unlike the officers outside, his expression appeared calm rather than confrontational. He introduced himself, sat across from her, and offered a polite nod. "Ms. Carter, I would like to ask a few questions about your day." Naomi nodded. "Of course." The detective began with routine details. What time had she arrived at work? What apartment did she work in? When had she left the hospital? Naomi answered every question clearly. She explained her shift, the patients she cared for, the co-workers who could verify her location throughout the afternoon. The detective wrote everything down carefully. Unlike earlier, someone was finally listening. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes before he paused. "Is there anything unusual you noticed today?" he asked. Naomi hesitated. The memory returned immediately. "Actually, yes." The detective looked up. "Go ahead." Naomi leaned forward slightly. "When I left the hospital parking structure, I noticed a man standing beside a silver sedan." The detective's pen stopped moving. "What about him?" "He seemed nervous." "Nervous how?" Naomi searched for the right words. "Like he was expecting something to happen." He kept looking over his shoulder. The detective exchanged a thoughtful glance with the notes in front of him. "Did you see anyone else?" Naomi closed her eyes briefly, trying to remember. Rain. Gray sky. Concrete pillars. Then another detail surfaced. There was a woman near the car. "Can you describe her?" "Not clearly. She stayed near the passenger side. But I remember thinking they looked like they were waiting for someone." The detective wrote quickly now. His expression had changed. Something about the information had captured his attention. Before he could ask another question, a notification appeared on his tablet. He looked down. "Read the screen. Then read it again." Naomi noticed the subtle shift in his posture. "What is it?" she asked. The detective did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned the tablet toward himself and studied the new information carefully. Outside the room, activity suddenly increased. Voices became louder. Footsteps moved faster through the hallway. Whatever had appeared on that screen had changed something. And for the first time since she entered the building, Naomi began to suspect that the investigation might be moving in a very different direction. The detective stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the tablet down on the table. Naomi immediately noticed the change in his expression. Earlier, he had seemed cautious. Now he looked focused, almost concerned. Outside the interview room, movement continued increasing throughout the precinct. Officers crossed the hallway carrying folders. A phone rang somewhere nearby. Another door opened and closed. Whatever information had arrived was affecting more than one person. "Ms. Carter," the detective said carefully, "I need to ask a few more questions about the silver sedan." Naomi nodded. "Of course." The detective opened a new page in his notebook. "You said you saw a man and a woman near the vehicle." "Yes." "Did you notice anything distinctive?" Naomi looked toward the ceiling for a moment, replaying the memory. The concrete parking structure, the gray afternoon sky, the sound of distant traffic. Then a detail surfaced. "The man kept checking his watch," she said. "Several times." The detective wrote quickly. Anything else? Naomi hesitated. The woman was holding a folder. What kind of folder? Dark blue. Maybe black. I am not completely sure. The detective stopped writing and leaned back slightly. The reaction was subtle, but Naomi noticed it. That detail mattered. Before she could ask why, the door opened. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped into the room carrying a stack of printed photographs. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his uniform. He placed the photographs on the table and exchanged a brief look with the detective. Neither spoke for a moment. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Ryan slid one of the photographs toward Naomi. Have you seen this vehicle before? Naomi looked down. Her heartbeat quickened. The silver sedan filled most of the image. It had been captured by a traffic camera. From a different angle, but she recognized it instantly. Yes, she said. That is the car. Ryan nodded slowly. The certainty in her voice left little room for doubt. The detective placed another photograph beside the first. This one showed a parking lot several miles away. The same vehicle appeared near a commercial building. A timestamp sat in the corner of the image. Naomi studied it carefully. That was earlier in the day, Ryan explained. Several hours before you saw it. Naomi looked from one photograph to another. A strange feeling settled over her. The car was appearing in too many places. Too many unrelated locations. What exactly are you investigating? She asked quietly. Ryan and the detective exchanged another glance. We are still figuring that out, the detective answered. Naomi could tell there was more to the story than they were saying. Much more. Meanwhile, on the second floor of the precinct, analysts reviewed surveillance footage arriving from businesses throughout the city. Screen after screen displayed intersections, parking lots, office buildings, and gas stations. One analyst suddenly paused a video feed and leaned closer to the monitor. Wait a second, she said. Another investigator moved beside her. The footage showed the silver sedan entering a parking garage. A man stepped out. Then the image sharpened slightly as the camera adjusted. The investigator's eyes widened. Get Mitchell down here. Back inside the interview room, Ryan's radio crackled. A voice called his name. He listened. His expression immediately changed. Are you serious? He asked. Several seconds passed. Then he looked toward the detective. They found something. Both men stood at once. Naomi watched them gather the photographs. What happened? She asked. Ryan hesitated. The man from the surveillance footage. He glanced at the pictures on the table. We may finally know who he is. The detective picked up his notebook and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he stopped and looked back at Naomi. For the first time since she entered the station, there was no suspicion in his eyes. Only curiosity. Ms. Carter, he said, that detail about the folder may turn out to be more important than you realize. Then they disappeared into the hallway. The door closed behind them. Naomi sat alone once again, listening to the growing activity beyond the walls. Somewhere in the building, investigators were connecting pieces she did not yet understand. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The focus of the investigation was slowly moving away from her and toward the people standing beside that silver sedan. The hallway outside the interview room seemed louder than before. Naomi could hear hurried footsteps moving back and forth across the precinct, followed by the occasional ring of a telephone and the low murmur of urgent conversations. Something significant had changed. She could feel it. The suspicion that had surrounded her when she first arrived was beginning to shift towards something else entirely. She sat quietly at the metal table, watching the rain slide down the narrow window beside the door. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm. Minute after minute. Tick after tick. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the door opened again. The detective returned first. Officer Ryan Mitchell followed close behind. Both men carried new folders. Neither looked the same as they had earlier. The certainty that once defined Ryan's expression had been replaced by concentration. The detective placed several photographs on the table. Ms. Carter, he said, taking a seat across from her. We need you to look at these. Naomi nodded and pulled the photographs closer. The first image showed the silver sedan entering a parking structure. The second showed the vehicle leaving less than 20 minutes later. The third caused her eyes to widen slightly. It captured a clearer view of the man she had noticed earlier. The image was still grainy, but his face was visible enough to recognize. That is him, Naomi said immediately. Ryan leaned forward. You are sure? Yes. 100%. Naomi looked at the photograph again. The same nervous posture. the same habit of checking over his shoulder. I am sure. Ryan exchanged a glance with the detective. Neither spoke for a moment. Then the detective slid another document across the table. It contained information about the individual in the photograph. Much of the text was covered, but a few details remained visible. Naomi noticed references to financial investigations, missing records, and multiple states. Who is he? She asked. The detective carefully folded the paper closed. Someone we should have been paying attention to much earlier. Naomi felt a chill move through her chest. The rain outside intensified, drumming softly against the building. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ryan pointed toward one of the photographs. Tell me again about the folder. Naomi looked down. The woman near the car was holding it. What made you remember that detail? Naomi thought for a moment. Because it seemed important to her. She kept opening it and looking inside. Ryan's eyes narrowed. The detective quickly wrote something down. Then another officer appeared at the doorway. We found additional footage, he announced. You need to see this. Within minutes, Naomi was escorted into a larger conference room. Computer monitors lined the walls. Investigators studied screens displaying maps, timestamps, and surveillance footage from around the city. The atmosphere felt completely different from the interview room. Focused, intense, purposeful. One analyst enlarged a video on the main screen. The silver sedan appeared again. This time the angle was clearer. Naomi watched carefully. The man exited the vehicle. The woman stepped out moments later carrying the same dark folder. Then something unexpected happened. A third person entered the frame. Several investigators immediately leaned forward. Pause it, Ryan said. The image froze. The room fell silent. Naomi stared at the screen. She had never seen the third person before. Yet the reaction around her suggested everyone else recognized him. The detective looked toward a senior investigator standing near the back of the room. That confirms it. The senior investigator nodded slowly. This is much bigger than we thought. Naomi looked from face to face. Questions filled her mind. The investigation that had started with her standing in a pharmacy parking lot was clearly expanding into something far more serious. Ryan crossed his arms and stared at the frozen image. For the first time all evening, he seemed less concerned with proving his original theory and more concerned with understanding what was actually happening. Then his phone vibrated. He checked the screen. The color drained slightly from his face. What is it? The detective asked. Ryan looked up. Someone just contacted a federal field office. The room became completely silent. About this case? The detective asked. Ryan nodded. And according to the message, a federal agent is already on his way here. The room remained silent long after Ryan lowered his phone. The glow from the surveillance screens painted pale blue reflections across the walls while rain continued tapping against the windows beyond the operations center. Every investigator seemed to be thinking the same thing. Federal involvement changed everything. Naomi stood near the evidence table, watching expressions shift around the room. Earlier that evening, she had been treated as the focus of the investigation. Now nobody seemed interested in proving she was connected to the case. Instead, every conversation centered on the silver sedan, the mysterious folder, and the people appearing in the surveillance footage. The detective studied the frozen image on the large screen. Did they say which federal office? He asked. Ryan nodded. Downtown field office. Several people exchanged looks. One analyst immediately turned back toward her computer and began pulling additional records. Another investigator gathered files from the table. The entire room seemed to move with renewed urgency. Naomi looked toward the photograph still displayed on the monitor. The man she had seen outside the hospital parking structure remained frozen in place on the screen. It was strange. Just a few hours earlier, he had been a passing stranger she barely noticed. Now he appeared to be at the center of something much larger than anyone had imagined. The detective approached Naomi. There is something I need to ask you. She turned toward him. Of course. He placed another photograph in front of her. This image showed the woman standing beside the sedan. The quality was clearer than before. Naomi studied the face carefully. Several seconds passed. Then her eyes widened slightly. I remember something. The detective leaned forward. What? Naomi looked at the photograph. She was not nervous. What do you mean? The man kept checking his surroundings. The woman did not. The detective frowned. Why does that matter? Naomi pointed toward the image. Because she looked confident. Like she already knew exactly what was supposed to happen. The room grew quiet again. It was a small observation, but investigators understood the value of small observations. Sometimes the difference between confusion and clarity was hidden inside a detail everyone else ignored. One of the analysts suddenly called out from across the room. "We have another match." Heads immediately turned. She enlarged a document on one of the monitors. A series of financial records appeared. Names, transactions, locations. Several states were highlighted. The detective walked over. Ryan followed. Naomi watched from a distance as both men examined the information. Neither looked pleased. Whatever they were seeing confirmed their growing suspicions. Then another notification appeared on a nearby screen. A traffic camera image. The silver sedan again. This time parked outside a commercial office building less than 3 hours before Naomi had seen it at the hospital. The detective slowly exhaled. This was never random. Ryan nodded. No, for the first time all night. His voice carried uncertainty instead of confidence. Naomi noticed it immediately. The certainty that had led him to stop her in the parking lot was fading. Evidence was replacing assumptions. Facts were replacing first impressions. The realization seemed to weigh heavily on him. Nearly 30 minutes passed. Rain continued falling outside while investigators assembled timelines across digital displays. Then the main entrance doors opened somewhere beyond the operations center. A moment later, the sound of measured footsteps echoed through the hallway. Nobody announced anything. Nobody needed to. The atmosphere changed instantly. Several officers glanced toward the corridor. "Hey." Supervisor straightened his posture. Conversations softened. Naomi looked toward the doorway just as a tall man entered the operations center wearing a dark suit beneath a rain-soaked overcoat. The silver badge clipped to his belt caught the overhead light for a brief moment. Her breath caught in her throat. Daniel Carter. Relief washed over her so quickly that she almost laughed. The exhaustion she had been carrying all evening suddenly felt lighter. Daniel's eyes searched the room. The moment he spotted Naomi, his expression softened. He crossed the room without hesitation. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Naomi nodded. "I am now." Around them, investigators exchanged surprised glances. The detective looked from Naomi to Daniel, then toward Ryan. Understanding began spreading across the room. Ryan stared for a moment before finally speaking. "Wait." His voice was barely above a whisper. "You know Agent Carter?" Naomi looked at him calmly. "He is my husband." The room fell completely silent. For several seconds, nobody moved. The operations center seemed frozen beneath the glow of computer screens and fluorescent lights. Rain continued tapping against the windows, but even that sound felt distant now. Ryan Mitchell stood motionless, trying to process what he had just heard. The woman he had stopped in a pharmacy parking lot. The woman he had treated as a possible suspect. The woman whose observations were now helping reshape the entire investigation. She was married to a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent standing only a few feet away. Yet the biggest surprise was not Daniel Carter's arrival. It was his reaction. Daniel did not demand answers. He did not raise his voice. He did not question anyone's authority. Instead, he looked toward the evidence spread across the room. Photographs, timelines, surveillance images, financial records. His attention moved carefully across every detail before returning to Naomi. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly. Naomi explained everything. The parking lot, the questioning, the interview room, the silver sedan, the nervous man, the woman carrying the folder. Daniel listened without interrupting. The detective listened too. So did Ryan. By the time Naomi finished, the room felt different. The focus was no longer on who she was connected to. It was on what she had seen. Daniel finally nodded. "The sedan matters," he said. "And so does the folder." The detective crossed his arms. "We are starting to believe the same thing." One of the analysts suddenly appeared beside them carrying a tablet. "You need to see this." The screen displayed newly recovered surveillance footage from a commercial office building. The video showed the silver sedan parked near a service entrance. The image quality was far from perfect, but one detail stood out immediately. The woman exited the vehicle holding the same folder Naomi had described. Several minutes later, she entered the building carrying nothing. The folder was gone. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. "Can we identify the office?" The analyst nodded. "Third floor. Financial consulting firm." The detective exchanged a glance with Ryan. Both men immediately understood the significance. Earlier records had already connected the mysterious man to multiple financial investigations. Now another piece was falling into place. Naomi studied the footage. Something about it continued bothering her. Not the building. Not the woman. The timing. Can you replay it? She asked. The analyst restarted the video. Naomi watched carefully. Again. Then once more. Suddenly, she pointed toward the corner of the screen. Stop. The image froze. Several investigators moved closer. What do you see? The detective asked. Naomi pointed toward a reflection in the building's glass entrance. Barely visible. Almost hidden. A fourth person stood near the doorway. He was there the whole time, she said. The analyst enlarged the image. Grainy pixels filled the screen. Yet a silhouette remained visible. Tall. Well-dressed. Waiting. The room grew quiet. Can we identify him? Ryan asked. The analyst shook her head. Not yet. Daniel stared at the image. Maybe we do not need a face. Everyone looked toward him. He pointed at the man's wrist. A distinctive watch reflected the building lights. The detective immediately understood. Corporate event photos, he said. Executive profiles. Public appearances. The analyst hurried back to her workstation. New searches began immediately. Around the room, investigators returned to their screens with renewed energy. Naomi stepped back from the table and looked toward the rain-covered window. Hours earlier, she had felt powerless, trapped inside a misunderstanding she could not control. Now the investigation was moving because someone finally listened. Daniel quietly joined her near the glass. The city lights shimmered beyond the storm. You know, he said softly, most people would have focused only on what happened to them. Naomi watched rainwater slide down the window. I kept thinking about that man. Daniel smiled slightly. That is exactly why they are finding answers. Across the room, a sudden voice broke the silence. We found him. Every head turned toward the analyst. Her eyes remained fixed on the monitor. The fourth person has a name. The room came alive again. Chairs moved. Investigators stood. The next piece of the puzzle had finally appeared. The analyst's words seemed to electrify the entire operations center. Conversations stopped instantly. Investigators turned toward the monitor. Even the steady rhythm of rain against the windows felt quieter for a moment. Naomi looked across the room as the analyst enlarged the image on the screen. A profile appeared beside a collection of corporate records, public photographs, and financial filings. The face belonged to a well-known executive who sat on the board of several investment companies throughout the region. The detective stared at the screen. You are sure? The analyst nodded. The watch matched. Then the facial comparison matched. Then the travel records matched. Ryan slowly lowered his hands from his crossed arms. The certainty returned to his face, but this time it was directed toward evidence rather than assumptions. Daniel studied the information carefully. How many companies is he connected to? The analyst scrolled through another page. More than a dozen. The room grew quiet again. The answer explained why the investigation had become so complicated. The silver sedan was never the center of the story. It was only a thread. One small thread connected to something much larger. Naomi looked at the photographs spread across the evidence table. The nervous man. The woman with the folder. The executive standing in the reflection. Suddenly, every piece seemed connected. The folder, she said softly. Several heads turned toward her. What about it? The detective asked. Naomi pointed toward the surveillance images. Everyone keeps focusing on the people. She paused. What if the folder is what brought them together? Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Go on. Naomi looked back at the screen. The man looked nervous. The woman looked confident. The executive never touched the folder himself. It feels like everyone had a different role. The detective exchanged a glance with Ryan. Then he turned toward the analyst. Can we track the documents? Several minutes later, new information appeared. The folder likely contained financial records linked to multiple transactions under investigation. Records that had moved through several organizations over the previous year. Records that someone clearly wanted transferred without attracting attention. Daniel slowly nodded. That explains the behavior. Ryan looked at Naomi. You noticed that from a few seconds in a parking structure? Naomi shrugged slightly. Something felt wrong. The answer seemed almost too simple. Yet nobody laughed. Nobody dismissed it. Because every major breakthrough of the night traced back to a detail she had noticed while everyone else was focused elsewhere. Another analyst suddenly stood from her workstation. There is more. The room turned toward her. The executive was scheduled to attend a private meeting tonight. The detective stepped forward. Where? She read from the screen. A corporate retreat center outside the city. Ryan looked at the clock. That meeting is happening right now. Within seconds, the operations center exploded into motion. Calls were placed. Notifications were sent. Agencies began coordinating information. Naomi watched the activity unfold around her with growing disbelief. The investigation that started with her standing in a pharmacy parking lot had transformed into something no one expected. Yet the biggest surprise arrived moments later. The detective approached Daniel carrying a folder. "You should probably see this." Daniel opened it. His expression changed immediately. "What is it?" Naomi asked. Daniel handed her the document. She looked down. The first page contained a timeline created earlier in the evening. At the top sat the original working theory investigators had used when they stopped her. Naomi stared at it silently. Every assumption, every incorrect connection, every reason they believed she belonged in the investigation. None of it held up anymore. The detective folded his arms. The timeline collapsed completely. Ryan looked down at the floor. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The truth hung heavily in the air. Naomi had never belonged on that timeline. She had never been the person they should have been looking for. She was the person who helped expose why the timeline was wrong. Daniel closed the folder. "Then there is only one thing left to do." The detective nodded. Ryan nodded too. Across the room, the first rays of early morning light began filtering through the rain clouds outside. The storm was finally starting to break. And for the first time all night, everyone in the room was looking in the same direction. The first signs of dawn began appearing beyond the rain clouds as the operations center settled into a different kind of energy. The frantic uncertainty that had filled the building earlier was gone. In its place stood something stronger. Clarity. Computer screens continued glowing across the room while investigators organized reports, confirmed timelines, and finalized findings. The evidence was no longer pointing in 10 different directions. It was pointing toward the truth. Naomi stood quietly beside one of the large windows. The storm had weakened. Thin streams of rain still slid down the glass, but patches of pale morning light were beginning to appear between the clouds. Daniel stood nearby reviewing documents with the detective. Their conversation remained calm and professional. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was trying to defend old assumptions. The facts spoke for themselves now. Across the room, Ryan Mitchell remained seated at a desk studying the investigation timeline. He had spent nearly an hour reviewing every stage of the case from the beginning. Every report, every witness statement, every decision. The deeper he looked, the clearer one reality became. The investigation had moved forward only after someone stopped treating Naomi as a possibility and started listening to her as a witness. That realization sat heavily on his shoulders. The detective finally closed the last folder and approached Naomi. "We received confirmation," he said. Naomi turned toward him. "Confirmation of what?" The detective smiled for the first time all night. The documents connected to the folder contained financial records investigators had been searching for over a year. Naomi looked toward the evidence table. "So it was never about me." "No," the detective replied. "It never was." The simple sentence filled the room with a quiet kind of gravity. Not because everyone had already known it, because everyone now understood it completely. Daniel stepped beside his wife. His expression remained calm, but Naomi could see the pride in his eyes. Not because she had proven anyone wrong, because she had remained herself through the entire ordeal. Another analyst walked over carrying a finalized report. "The task force approved everything," she announced. "The evidence chain is complete." Several investigators exchanged relieved smiles. Months of unanswered questions had finally begun to make sense. Yet while everyone else focused on reports and findings, Ryan remained seated at his desk. Eventually, he stood and walked slowly across the room. The conversations around him softened. Naomi noticed him approaching. So did Daniel. Ryan stopped a few feet away. For a moment, he said nothing. The fluorescent lights reflected softly across the polished floor beneath them. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Then Ryan looked directly at Naomi. "I owe you an apology." The room became completely still. Naomi waited. Ryan took a slow breath. "When I saw you in that parking lot, I believed I knew what I was looking at." His voice remained steady. "I trusted my assumptions more. Then I trusted the possibility that I could be wrong." Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Ryan continued. "You deserved patience. You deserved fairness. Instead, I saw what I expected to see." The words hung in the air. honest, uncomfortable, necessary. Naomi studied his expression. There was no excuse hidden behind his apology. No attempt to justify what happened. Only accountability. "Thank you for saying that," she replied softly. Ryan nodded. Then he glanced toward the evidence spread throughout the room. "The truth is, you helped solve the very thing I was supposed to be investigating." Naomi smiled faintly. "We all helped." Ryan looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "Maybe, but you were the first person who noticed what everyone else missed." For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Naomi extended her hand. Ryan looked surprised. A moment later, he shook it. The gesture was simple, quiet, yet everyone in the room understood its meaning. Not forgiveness without accountability. Not victory over another person. Something better. Understanding. Outside, the clouds finally began to separate. Golden sunlight slipped through the gaps and illuminated the city beyond the glass. The storm was over, and for the first time since the long night began, peace settled across the room. By the time Naomi and Daniel stepped out of the precinct, the city had fully awakened. The storm that had dominated the night existed only in scattered puddles along the sidewalks and the faint scent of rain lingering in the cool morning air. Sunlight stretched between glass buildings and reflected across wet streets like ribbons of gold. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt earned. Behind them, investigators continued their work. Reports would be completed. Evidence would be reviewed. Meetings would be scheduled. The process would continue. But for Naomi, the most important part was already over. She paused near the bottom of the precinct steps and looked back at the building. Less than 12 hours earlier, she had entered through those doors, surrounded by uncertainty. She remembered the stairs, the assumptions, the feeling of being judged before anyone truly listened. Now the same building stood beneath bright morning light, transformed not because the structure had changed, but because the truth had finally reached the people inside it. Daniel noticed her looking back. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Naomi smiled softly. How differently this night could have ended. Daniel followed her gaze toward the precinct. Maybe, if nobody had listened. Daniel nodded. But someone did. They began walking toward the parking garage. Around them, the city moved through its normal routines. Commuters crossed intersections carrying coffee cups. Delivery trucks rolled through traffic. Storefronts opened for business. Ordinary life continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Naomi found comfort in that. Not every victory needed an audience. Halfway across the block, her phone vibrated. A message from one of her coworkers appeared on the screen. Then another, and another. Several nurses from the children's hospital had been trying to reach her throughout the night. One message simply read, "We hope you are okay." Another said, "The kids keep asking when you are coming back." Naomi laughed quietly. Daniel looked over. "Good news." She nodded. "The best kind." She slipped the phone into her coat pocket and continued walking. Above them, sunlight broke completely through the remaining clouds. Across the street, a row of office windows reflected the morning sky. Everything felt brighter than it had a few hours ago. Back inside the precinct, Officer Ryan Mitchell stood near a second-floor window looking out at the city below. He watched Naomi and Daniel disappear into the flow of pedestrians. In his hand rested the final investigation summary. The document contained names, dates, locations, and evidence. It explained how investigators uncovered the truth. Yet the most important lesson from the night was nowhere in the report. It could not be filed away inside a folder. It existed in a simple realization. Facts deserved patience. People deserved fairness. Assumptions were not evidence. Ryan folded the report and placed it on his desk. Then he looked out the window one final time before returning to work. Outside, Naomi and Daniel reached their car. Daniel opened the passenger door. Naomi paused before getting inside and looked toward the horizon. The city skyline shimmered beneath clear morning light. The storm was gone. The long night was gone. What remained was something much quieter. Something stronger. Dignity. She thought about the frightened children she cared for at the hospital. The ones who often asked whether things would be okay. The ones who needed reassurance when life felt uncertain. She realized that truth worked much the same way. Sometimes it took longer than people wanted. Sometimes it traveled through confusion before finding its destination. But when people chose to listen, it eventually arrived. Naomi climbed into the car. Daniel closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. A moment later, they pulled away from the curb and joined the morning traffic. No celebration followed. No speeches. No dramatic farewell. Only sunlight reflecting across wet pavement as two people returned to their lives. Behind them, a difficult night faded into memory. Ahead of them, a new day waited. And as the city continued waking beneath the bright sky, the truth moved quietly forward with them, steady, undeniable, and finally heard.